Hey guys, tonight we're going on a treasure hunt. But instead of gold and jewels, our bounty is lost knowledge. We're diving deep into the ancient world, specifically to a place that was once the undisputed intellectual capital of the universe, the Library of Alexandria. Imagine it as the Google, Wikipedia, and Harvard of its time, all rolled into one magnificent, sprawling complex. You might think, oh, a library. How exciting. But trust me, this wasn't your local quiet reading room. This was a buzzing hive of genius, intrigue, and frankly, some pretty ruthless book acquisition strategies. You're about to step into an era where papyrus was paramount and knowledge was power. Sometimes, literally, a power you might not even survive wielding in those days. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And seriously, drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's wild to think about how many different time zones we're all sharing this moment in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, not by some fancy time machine, but by the sheer force of imagination, to the sun-drenched shores of ancient Egypt. Around the Satrid century BCE, the air is warm, thick with the scent of spices and the distant murmur of a bustling city. This isn't just any city. This is Alexandria, a glittering jewel built by Alexander the Great himself, destined to become a crossroads of cultures and ideas. And at its heart, like a colossal beacon, is the library. But how did this grand institution even come to be? Well, it all starts with a little bit of ambition and a lot of dynastic vision. After Alexander the Great shuffled off this mortal coil, a rather dramatic exit. As we all know, Sati's vast empire was carved up among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy I Soter, got the choicest piece of the pie, Egypt. Ptolemy, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, understood that to legitimize his new dynasty and solidify Alexandria's position as a powerhouse, he needed more than just military might. He needed brains, he needed prestige. And what better way to achieve that than by gathering all the world's knowledge under one roof? So you stand there, perhaps a curious traveler or a newly arrived scholar, gazing at the nascent stages of what would become the intellectual heart of the ancient world. It wasn't built overnight. Of course, it began with the museum, which sounds like a dusty gallery of artifacts. But in Greek, Mausion literally means seat of the muses. Think of it more as a research institute, a grand academy where scholars lived, studied, and debated, funded by the royal purse. The library was an integral part of this museum, its intellectual engine room. Ptolemy I, and especially his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, were obsessed. They weren't just collecting books, they were collecting the very essence of human thought. Imagine the excitement, the buzz, as ships arrived from all corners of the Mediterranean, laden not just with exotic goods, but with precious scrolls. You might see a team of scribes, their hands stained with ink, diligently copying every text they could get their hands on. It was an intellectual arms race, and Alexandria was determined to win. Now, here's a little tidbit that often gets overlooked. The library wasn't just one building, it was a complex. The main collection was housed in the Royal Library within the museum, a grand structure probably containing the most prized and rarest texts. But there was also a smaller, though still significant, collection at the Serapeum, a temple dedicated to the god Serapis. Think of it as a satellite branch, perhaps more accessible to the general public, or holding different types of texts. This distinction becomes quite important later when we talk about what actually happened to all those books. History, as you'll quickly learn, is rarely a simple all or nothing kind of story. The goal? To acquire every single book written in the known world. Yes, you heard that right, every single book. This wasn't some casual hobby project. This was a systematic, state-sponsored endeavor. They sent agents across the globe, literally scouring markets, negotiating with rulers, and even, shall we say, persuading travelers to part with their precious scrolls. You can almost picture the scene. A ship docks in Alexandria, and before anyone can even disembark. Royal agents are already on board, politely but firmly demanding to inspect all written materials. Any scroll found was immediately confiscated, taken to the library, copied by skilled scribes, and only then, sometimes, would the original be returned. More often than not, the copy was returned and the precious original was added to Alexandria's ever-growing collection. This practice, often referred to as the ship tax, was pretty brazen. Wouldn't you agree? It certainly ruffled a few feathers, but the Ptolemies clearly thought the ends justified the means. The sheer scale of this ambition is mind-boggling. We're talking about a time before printing presses, before digital archives. Every single book was a handwritten scroll, painstakingly copied, often on expensive papyrus. So, the accumulation of hundreds of thousands of these scrolls represented an immense investment in time, labor, and resources. You can almost feel the weight of knowledge pressing down on you as you imagine walking through corridors lined with shelf after shelf of these rolled up treasures. Historians still debate the exact number of scrolls the library held at its peak. Some ancient sources claim hundreds of thousands, even up to 700 scrolls. Now, remember, a scroll wasn't necessarily a book as we know it. A single epic poem might be spread across multiple scrolls. So, translating those numbers into modern book equivalents is a bit tricky, and academic circles are still very much in disagreement on the precise figures. But one thing is certain: it was an unparalleled collection, an explosion of information, covering everything from philosophy and poetry to medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. It was the intellectual heart of the ancient world, drawing scholars like moths to a flame, and it was just getting started. You're still standing there, amidst the bustling intellectual machinery of Alexandria, and the sheer volume of knowledge being accumulated is almost dizzying. Imagine the scene: enormous halls filled with shelves, each holding countless papyrus scrolls. These weren't neatly bound books with spine titles. They were rolls of dried, pressed papyrus reeds, often with a small tag indicating the title and author. To read a scroll, you'd unroll it with one hand and roll it up with the other, a surprisingly physical act. Try picturing yourself navigating these vast collections. Thought it was a true labyrinth of learning, and definitely not designed for a quick browse. The scale of this operation was truly unprecedented. The Ptolemies, those ambitious rulers of Egypt, didn't just want books, they practically demanded them. Their passion bordered on obsession, fueled by a desire for prestige and, let's be honest, probably a healthy dose of competitive spirit with other burgeoning intellectual centers. They wanted Alexandria to be the place for scholarship, and to do that, they needed all the books. This wasn't just about collecting, it was about curating, preserving, and most importantly, making knowledge accessible to the brilliant minds they were attracting. One of the most famous, and perhaps infamous, methods of acquisition was what we touched on earlier: the ship tax. If your ship docked in Alexandria, and you had any scrolls on board, personal letters, merchant records, philosophical treatises sought, they were all subject to inspection. Any text deemed worthy was immediately seized, taken to the library, and copied. The copy was then returned to the owner, and the original was kept for the library's collection. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a merchant or a traveller. You've brought a valuable text, maybe a rare edition of Homer, hoping to sell it or share it with a friend. And suddenly, the king's agents are confiscating it. You'd probably be a bit miffed, right? But what were you going to do? Argue with the most powerful library in the world, backed by the pharaoh himself? Probably not. It was a brazen display of power, a clear statement that when it came to knowledge, Alexandria played by its own rules. But it wasn't all about forceful acquisition. The library also actively pursued texts through more conventional means. For the time anyway, they bought books from markets, often outbidding anyone else. They hired agents to travel to distant lands specifically to track down and purchase rare manuscripts. Imagine being one of those agents, traversing dusty roads and treacherous seas, all in pursuit of a forgotten epic poem or a newly discovered medical text. It was a relentless, worldwide quest for knowledge, an ancient version of global scouting for intellectual talent and resources. Now, you might wonder about the quantity. Just how many scrolls are we talking about? Ancient sources throw around astonishing numbers. Some claim over 500 zero scrolls. Others even stretch it to 700 zero. To put that in perspective, consider that a single significant work, like Homer's Iliad, might have been spread across multiple scrolls. So 500 zero scrolls doesn't necessarily mean 500 zero individual books as we understand them today. It's more like 500 zero volumes. Some short, some very long. Even so, it was an absolutely colossal collection, far surpassing anything else in the ancient world. Think of it as a pre-industrial data center, housing the sum total of human wisdom known at the time. This immense collection wasn't just stored away, it was meticulously organized and catalogued. This was a massive undertaking in itself. The head librarian, a position of immense prestige, was responsible for managing this intellectual empire. One of the most famous head librarians was Callimachus of Cyrene, who undertook the monumental task of creating the Pinax. This was essentially the world's first comprehensive library catalogue, a multi-volume bibliography that listed every scroll, its author, subject matter, and even the first few lines of text. Imagine the effort involved in cataloguing hundreds of thousands of handwritten scrolls, all before the advent of printing or computers. It was a project that would make modern librarians weep with both admiration and despair. This dedication to cataloging wasn't just about neatness, it was about making the knowledge accessible. Scholars coming to Alexandria didn't have to wander aimlessly. They could consult the Pinax to find exactly what they needed. This systematization of knowledge was a revolutionary concept, turning a mere collection into a truly functional, searchable archive. It was a testament to the fact that the Ptolemies weren't just hoarders of information, they were facilitators of scholarship. However, a quirky little detail often gets lost in the grand narrative. While the library prided itself on having original texts, the process of copying and recopying also introduced its own set of challenges. Scribes, being human, made errors. Sometimes they misread a word. Sometimes they skipped a line, and sometimes, perhaps inadvertently, they might have even corrected a text they thought was flawed. So, while the library aimed for perfect copies, the reality was that slight variations, sometimes significant ones, crept into the texts over generations of transcription. This is something historians still debate quite actively. How much did the errors of ancient scribes impact the accuracy of the texts we have inherited today? And what exactly was the original version of many classical works? It's a fascinating rabbit hole if you ever decide to go down it. So here you are, surrounded by this unprecedented collection, the air thick with the scent of papyrus and the quiet murmur of scholarly work. The Library of Alexandria was not just a building, it was a living, breathing entity, constantly growing, constantly refining, and constantly drawing in the best minds of the ancient world. The sheer audacity of its ambition, the ruthless efficiency of its acquisition, and the meticulous dedication to its organization made it truly unique. But this incredible accumulation of knowledge, like all great things, would also face challenges, ones that no amount of papyrus or ambition could entirely withstand. You're still in the heart of Alexandria, feeling the palpable hum of intellectual energy that permeated the library. It wasn't just the sheer volume of books that made this place extraordinary. It was the people. Imagine yourself walking through the grand halls. Past scholars hunched over scrolls, their faces illuminated by oil lamps, engaged in intense debate or silent, profound thought. This wasn't just a storage facility for books. It was a living, breathing university, a research institute, a hub for the greatest minds of the ancient world. The Ptolemies, those shrewd rulers we talked about, knew that simply collecting books wasn't enough. You needed brilliant minds to read them, interpret them, and create new knowledge. So they actively recruited the most distinguished scholars, poets, philosophers, astronomers, and physicians from across the Hellenistic world. They offered them incredibly generous stipends, free housing, shared meals, and, most importantly, unparalleled access to the vast collection of the library. Think of it as the ultimate academic fellowship program. Centuries before the term even existed, these scholars were truly rock stars of their time. They came to Alexandria from Greece, Sicily, Mesopotamia, and beyond, drawn by the irresistible pull of knowledge and the promise of royal patronage. They lived and worked within the museum, the larger research complex that housed the library. This setup fostered an incredible environment of collaboration and intellectual cross-pollination. You'd have mathematicians debating with poets, astronomers sharing insights with medical practitioners, all under one roof. It was a melting pot of ideas, a true intellectual superpower. Let's meet a few of these ancient luminaries. Because they really put Alexandria on the map, you might bump into Euclid, the father of geometry, whose elements laid the foundation for mathematics for over 2 millennia. He probably wasn't just in a quiet corner drawing triangles. He was teaching, discussing, and refining his ideas with other brilliant minds. Or perhaps you'd see Archimedes, a genius from Syracuse, who, though not a permanent resident, certainly visited and engaged with the Alexandrian scholars. Imagine him, perhaps excitedly explaining his principle of buoyancy or the mechanics of his screw pump to a skeptical audience. Then there was Eratosthenes, a truly remarkable polymath. He wasn't just a librarian, he was a geographer, mathematician, poet, and astronomer. His most incredible feat, calculating the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy using surprisingly simple observations of shadows at different latitudes. Think about that for a second. In an age without satellites or advanced instruments, he figured out the size of our planet just by being incredibly clever and having access to astronomical records. It's the kind of genius that makes you just shake your head in admiration. He even proposed adding a leap day to the calendar Saturn. Yes, that's right. The concept of a leap year has roots in Alexandria. Another giant was Herophilus, considered the father of anatomy. He was one of the first physicians to systematically dissect human cadavers, a practice that was considered taboo in many other parts of the ancient world. This allowed him to make groundbreaking discoveries about the human body, including distinguishing between arteries and veins and understanding the nervous system. Imagine the sheer audacity and intellectual courage it took to perform such dissections, driven by an insatiable curiosity about how the body worked. He basically rewrote the medical textbooks of his era. It wasn't all serious work, though. These scholars were also poets, playwrights, and literary critics. The library wasn't just about scientific discovery. It was also the custodian of Greek literature, diligently copying, editing, and annotating the works of Homer, Hesiod, and the great tragedians. They established definitive texts of these works, which means that the versions of these ancient masterpieces we read today are largely based on the scholarly efforts undertaken in Alexandria. It's thanks to them that we still have so much of classical Greek literature. Now, here's a quirky little detail that often gets overlooked. These esteemed scholars, despite their brilliance, were not immune to human foibles. There are stories, perhaps apocryphal, but certainly entertaining, of academic rivalries, petty jealousies, and fierce debates that went far beyond intellectual discourse. Imagine two renowned grammarians arguing heatedly over the correct punctuation of a single line in Homer, perhaps even coming to blows over it. It reminds you that even the most brilliant minds are still, well, just people with all their quirks and competitive streaks. And yes, historians still debate just how harmonious or fractious the atmosphere within the museum truly was. Was it a peaceful haven of learning or a simmering cauldron of academic one-upmanship? Probably a bit of both. Knowing human nature, the Ptolemies weren't just patrons. They actively engaged with these scholars. They funded their research, commissioned new works, and often sought their advice on matters of state. This symbiotic relationship between power and intellect was one of the key factors in the library's initial success and flourishing. It was a unique period where rulers saw the direct value in investing heavily in pure knowledge and intellectual pursuits, understanding that it brought immense prestige and long-term benefits to their dynasty and city. So, as you take in this vibrant intellectual hub, you realize that the Library of Alexandria was more than just a collection of scrolls. It was a crucible of creativity, a forum for debate, and a launchpad for discoveries that would shape human understanding for centuries to come. The scholars who walked its halls were not just guardians of ancient wisdom, they were pioneers, pushing the boundaries of what was known and leaving an indelible mark on the intellectual landscape of the world. But as we move forward, remember that even the brightest lights can cast long shadows, and the flourishing of this golden age would eventually face its own challenges and tests. You're still in the heart of Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and you've seen how the Ptolemies, through their sheer will and lavish spending, managed to assemble an unparalleled collection of knowledge and attract the greatest minds. But remember, the Ptolemies weren't just benevolent patrons of the arts and sciences, they were rulers. And like all rulers, their primary concern was maintaining power and solidifying their dynasty. This intertwining of royal ambition and intellectual pursuit is crucial to understanding the library's story. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which began with Ptolemy Isota after Alexander the Great's death, ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Imagine a line of pharaohs, but with Greek names and a distinctly Hellenistic flair. They were often brilliant, sometimes ruthless, and always self-serving. The library, magnificent as it wasn't just a passion project. It was a powerful tool for legitimacy and prestige. By making Alexandria the global center of learning, they were effectively saying, look at us. We are not just rulers of Egypt. We are the guardians of all human knowledge. We are the inheritors of Alexander's legacy, not just in military might, but in intellectual glory. This was a powerful form of soft power, centuries before anyone coined the term. As you wander through the imagined halls, you might notice the subtle shifts in the political winds. The early Ptolemies, like Ptolemy Ionithu, were absolute zealots for the library. They poured vast sums of money into it, literally emptying royal treasuries to acquire scrolls and fund scholars. Their reign was, arguably, the library's golden age. This was when the collection swelled to its largest size, and the most groundbreaking discoveries were made. They understood that intellectual brilliance attracted more intellectual brilliance, creating a virtuous cycle of innovation and fame. However, as generations passed, not every Ptolemy was quite so enlightened. Some were more interested in lavish lifestyles, military campaigns, or simply holding on to power through any means necessary, including fratricide and political assassinations. The Ptolemaic family tree was, shall we say, a bit tangled with a lot of unfortunate accidents. This meant that the consistent, unwavering support the library initially enjoyed began to fluctuate. You can almost feel the shift in the air, a subtle anxiety replacing the earlier unbridled optimism, as different rulers prioritized different things. For example, Ptolemy VA Physcon, who ruled off and on in the 2nd century BCE, was famously hostile to intellectuals. He expelled many scholars from Alexandria, essentially reversing generations of his ancestors' efforts to attract them. His reasoning? He felt they were too critical, too influential, and perhaps just too clever for his liking. Imagine the shock and dismay as scholars who had dedicated their lives to the library were suddenly forced to flee. This wasn't a direct attack on the buildings or the books, but it was a devastating blow to the intellectual community that made the library truly vibrant. Many of these expelled scholars went on to establish new intellectual centers elsewhere, spreading Alexandrian knowledge, but also diminishing its unique concentration of talent. This incident is a stark reminder that the flourishing of knowledge often depends not just on resources, but on the tolerance and foresight of its rulers. Now, here's a quirky little detail that often gets overlooked in the grand narratives of kings and queens. The day-to-day funding of the library and museum was a monumental logistical task. Imagine having hundreds of scholars on salary, housing them, feeding them, providing scribes, papyrus, and ink. It was an enormous drain on the royal treasury. And while the early Ptolemies saw it as an investment, later rulers might have viewed it as a burdensome expense. This economic pressure, subtle at first, would contribute to the library's long-term vulnerabilities. Historians still debate just how much of the library's later decline can be attributed to changing dynastic priorities versus external factors. Was it economic strain, intellectual stagnation, or simply the shifting sands of political power that initiated its eventual demise? It's rarely just one thing, is it? The political instability within the Ptolemaic dynasty itself also played a significant role. Infighting, civil wars, and constant power struggles were common. When a new ruler seized power, especially violently, there was often a purge of those associated with the previous regime. This could include scholars and officials, disrupting the continuity of management and intellectual direction at the library. Imagine a grand institution constantly trying to navigate these turbulent political waters. Its very existence dependent on the whims of a volatile royal family. You might even see some of the library's own practices come back to bite it. The ship tax and ruthless acquisition, while building an impressive collection, also created resentment among other kingdoms and intellectual centers. This could lead to a less collaborative environment over time, as other cities became wary of sharing their knowledge with Alexandria. The very methods that made it great also, perhaps, made it a bit isolated. By the time we get to the later Ptolemies, the dynasty was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal strife and the growing power of Rome. The glamour and intellectual fervor that once defined Alexandria began to fade, replaced by a more pragmatic, often brutal, struggle for survival. The library, once a symbol of unassailable intellectual supremacy, found itself increasingly vulnerable to the shifting tides of power, no longer shielded by the unwavering dedication of its founders. It was a beautiful, shining beacon of knowledge, but like all great institutions, it was ultimately fragile, susceptible to the whims of human nature and the inexorable march of history. And as you'll soon see, those whims would become increasingly violent. You've witnessed the glorious rise of the Library of Alexandria, fueled by royal ambition and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. But as we move forward, the air around you begins to change. The peaceful hum of scholarly debate is slowly, subtly, replaced by the distant clang of metal and the murmur of worried whispers. The political landscape of the ancient world is shifting, and even a beacon of knowledge as grand as the library cannot escape the long shadow of war. Our story now shifts to the mid-10th century BCE, a tumultuous period for the Mediterranean world. The Roman Republic, a sprawling, ever expanding power, was asserting its dominance. Egypt, though still technically independent under the Ptolemies, was increasingly becoming a client state, caught in the intricate web of Roman politics. And guess who steps onto this stage, quite literally with a dramatic flair? None other than Julius Caesar. Caesar, fresh from his conquests in Gaul, found himself entangled in a messy civil war in Egypt, specifically the power struggle between the young pharaoh Ptolemy VI and his older, more famous sister, Cleopatra VI. Yes, that Cleopatra. You might imagine Caesar arriving in Alexandria, perhaps expecting a quiet diplomatic mission, only to be plunged into a chaotic, city-wide conflict. The Roman forces under Caesar's command were outnumbered and besieged within Alexandria. They found themselves cornered, fighting for their lives against Ptolemy C's army during one particularly desperate phase of the conflict. In 48 BCE, Caesar ordered the burning of his own ships in the harbour, Why? To prevent them from falling into enemy hands and to deny the Egyptian fleet their use. It was a tactical, if drastic, maneuver. Now, here's where the story gets really murky, and where the first significant blow to the library often comes into play. According to some ancient accounts, the fire spread from the ships in the harbour to the nearby docks, and then, devastatingly, to the Royal Library itself. Imagine the scene: roaring flames, plumes of smoke choking the Alexandrian sky, and the horrifying realization that not just ships, but countless irreplaceable scrolls are turning to ash. It's a truly chilling thought. The ultimate irony that the very act of preserving power led to the destruction of knowledge. But here's the thing about history, especially ancient history. It's rarely a simple, straightforward narrative. Historians still debate the extent of this damage and what exactly was lost. Some sources, like Plutarch and Dio Cassius, suggest a massive, catastrophic destruction of the library during Caesar's siege. They speak of 40, 50, or even more scrolls being destroyed. This is the version that has largely stuck in the popular imagination. Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria. However, other historians and archaeologists present a more nuanced picture. Seneca, for instance, mentions the burning of 40 books, but he doesn't specifically say it was the great library within the museum. Some argue that the fire might have destroyed a large collection of scrolls housed in warehouses near the docks, intended for export or simply stored there, rather than the main library building itself. Think of it as a significant loss. Yes, but perhaps not the total annihilation of the entire intellectual heart of Alexandria. It's like accidentally setting fire to a university's site storage archive rather than its main library building. Still bad, incredibly bad, but not the entire collection. A quirky detail that lends weight to this debate: if the main library was completely destroyed, why do we find evidence of many prominent scholars continuing to work in Alexandria after Caesar's time? Why did the library apparently continue to function, even if diminished? For example, the geographer Strabo, writing decades later, describes the museum and library as still existing and flourishing, though perhaps not with the same unbridled enthusiasm as its heyday. This suggests that while a significant loss occurred, it wasn't the definitive, singular event that wiped the library off the map. It was a grievous wound, undoubtedly, but not necessarily a death blow. It's entirely possible that Caesar's fire damaged a substantial portion of the collection. Perhaps the more recent acquisitions or those stored near the port. The main, older collection, carefully preserved within the museum, might have been largely spared. Papyrus scrolls, while flammable, often don't burn as completely as modern paper. A fire could damage a scroll, making it brittle or unreadable, without necessarily reducing it to total ash. Imagine trying to salvage fragile smoke. Damaged documents. Thought it would be a monumental task, and much would be lost, even if not utterly consumed by flames. So, when you picture the burning of the library, perhaps adjust your mental image slightly. It was a tragedy. A profound loss of precious texts, but probably not the single cataclysmic event that obliterated the entire institution in one fell swoop. Instead, it was more likely the first major injury, a painful foreshadowing of the vulnerabilities that even the greatest intellectual treasures face when caught in the unforgiving cross-currents of war and political upheaval. The library survived this initial brush with disaster, but it was irrevocably changed, and the seeds of its long, slow decline had been sown. The next chapters of our story will reveal that its eventual demise was far more complex than a single blaze. You've just witnessed the terrifying brush with disaster during Caesar's siege, a moment when the flame of knowledge flickered precariously. The library, though wounded, survived this initial blaze. But now, as the dust settles and the Roman Republic transforms into the mighty Roman Empire, the political landscape around you shifts dramatically once more. Alexandria, once the independent jewel of the Ptolemies, finds itself increasingly integrated into Rome's vast dominion. Imagine the change, no longer ruled by its own dynasty, but by Roman governors appointed from afar. The grand ambitions of the Ptolemies focused on making Alexandria the undisputed intellectual heart of the world, are now replaced by the more pragmatic, often military, concerns of a conquering empire. This isn't to say Rome hated knowledge. Quite the opposite. The Romans admired Greek culture and learning immensely. Many wealthy Romans had extensive private libraries, and scholars were certainly valued. However, the unique state-sponsored, singular focus on acquiring all knowledge, like the Ptolemies had, simply wasn't Rome's primary agenda for Alexandria. The library still functioned. Of course, for a time, it continued to be a place of learning and scholarship. You might still see dedicated scholars working in its halls, preserving texts and pursuing new discoveries. But the absolute priority, the seemingly limitless funding, and the fervent royal patronage that defined its golden age began to wane. The emperors in Rome had bigger fish to fry, like managing an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Alexandria was just one, albeit important, city among many. One significant change you might observe is the shifting nature of intellectual life. While Greek was still the language of scholarship and Hellenistic culture thrived, the focus gradually broadened. Roman scholars were interested in engineering, law, and rhetoric, such subjects that were perhaps more immediately useful to the functioning of an empire. The intense, almost fanatical pursuit of every single scroll from every corner of the world, a hallmark of the early Ptolemies, became less urgent. Here's a quirky little detail that often gets overlooked. The Roman conquest brought new architectural styles, new administrative practices, and new social dynamics to Alexandria. The city itself continued to be a vibrant metropolis, a key port for grain and trade, but its identity as the sole intellectual capital began to be challenged. Other cities within the Roman Empire, like Athens and later Constantinople, also maintained significant centers of learning. This diffusion meant Alexandria was no longer unique in its intellectual supremacy, even if it still held a venerable place. Perhaps a more subtle, yet profound, influence of Roman rule was the gradual shift in patronage. Instead of a single, incredibly wealthy royal family pouring all their resources into the library, intellectual endeavors now relied more on the support of individual wealthy Romans or the fluctuating interest of various emperors. This decentralized patronage could lead to periods of neglect as different emperors had different priorities. Historians still debate whether this shift in patronage was a major factor in the library's decline, or if it was simply a natural evolution as empires rise and fall. Was it a gradual erosion, or a series of sharp blows? The library, as we discussed, wasn't just one collection. There was the main royal library in the museum and the daughter library at the Serapeum. While the royal library may have suffered in Caesar's fire, the Serapeum collection seemed to endure, often acting as a significant repository of knowledge even as the main branch potentially struggled. Think of it as a backup drive, still containing a vast amount of data, even if the primary server was compromised. This resilience suggests that the idea of the library wasn't tied to a single physical structure, but was more of a dispersed intellectual entity. However, the Roman era also brought with it increasing social and religious tensions within the city of Alexandria. This city was always a melting pot, but under Roman rule, these diverse communities sought native Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and later, early Christians often clashed. These tensions, which would eventually boil over into outright violence, created an environment far less conducive to peaceful scholarly work. Imagine trying to concentrate on translating ancient texts when sectarian riots are breaking out just outside the library walls. It's not exactly ideal for deep thought, is it? So, as you observe Alexandria under Roman sway, you see a magnificent institution, still standing, still respected, but no longer quite as vigorously supported as it once was. The obsessive drive for total knowledge acquisition of the early Ptolemies had softened into a more general appreciation for learning. This period was not one of dramatic destruction, but rather of slow, creeping change. It was a time when the library became less of a unique, unparalleled beacon and more of a venerable, but increasingly vulnerable, component within a much larger and often turbulent empire. The stage is being set for the next, more definitive acts of decline, where intellectual purity would clash violently with burgeoning religious fervor. You felt the subtle shift in Alexandria under Roman rule, a slow settling from its feverish Ptolemaic peak. The city remained a center of learning, but the unbridled intellectual zeal had mellowed. Now, however, a new force is rising, not from political maneuvering or military campaigns, but from the depths of human belief, religion specifically. The burgeoning power of Christianity and its inevitable clash with the established intellectual and spiritual traditions of the Hellenistic world. Imagine the atmosphere in Alexandria during the Sotradhan centuries CE. It's a city teeming with different faiths and philosophies. You have the ancient Egyptian cults, the Greek polytheistic traditions, the Jewish community with its rich intellectual history, and now a rapidly growing Christian population. Early Christianity, still finding its footing and defining its doctrines, was often at odds with the pagan philosophical traditions that were deeply embedded in places like the library. The library, after all, was built on the foundations of pagan Greek thought. Its scrolls contained the works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and countless other thinkers who, from a strict Christian perspective, represented pagan or heathen knowledge. As Christianity gained more adherents and political influence, especially after its legalization and eventual embrace by Roman emperors like Constantine and Theodosius, the tension between these worldviews escalated. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic declaration of war on books. Instead, it was a gradual, often messy, conflict of ideas and ideologies. Christians, zealous in their new faith, saw the pagan temples and institutions, including parts of the museum and possibly the Serapeum Library, as bastions of idolatry and false teachings. Their goal wasn't necessarily to destroy knowledge per se, but to eradicate what they perceived as corrupting influences and pagan worship. Here's a quirky little detail that often gets overlooked. The early Christians weren't always against learning. In fact, many prominent Christian scholars, like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, actively engaged with Greek philosophy and even used it to help explain Christian theology. They saw value in certain aspects of classical learning, but always filtered through a Christian lens. However, for a more radical faction, anything associated with paganism was to be rejected or even obliterated. This internal tension within Christianity itself adds another layer of complexity to the story of the library's decline. Historians still debate the extent to which these different Christian factions contributed to the library's fate. Was it primarily an act of extreme zealotry, or a broader cultural shift against ancient traditions? The most significant and often cited event in this period, and one that directly impacted a part of the library, occurred in 390 1C. The Roman Emperor Theodosius had issued edicts effectively banning pagan worship throughout the empire. In Alexandria, this led to a violent confrontation between Christians and pagans. The Patriarch of Alexandria, Theophilus, a staunch anti-pagan, reportedly spearheaded the destruction of the Serapeum Temple. Imagine the scene. A mob, fueled by religious fervor, descends upon the grand temple of Serapis. This wasn't just a building, it housed the Serapeum Library, the daughter library of Alexandria, which we mentioned earlier, while the main royal library's fate, after Caesar's fire, is debated. Many scholars agree the Serapeum collection was still significant. The mob, acting on Theophilus's orders, or at least with his blessing, ransacked and destroyed the temple. They demolished statues, defaced pagan symbols, and almost certainly destroyed the scrolls housed within its library. This was a clear, unambiguous act of destruction directed at paganism and the knowledge associated with it. You might feel a chill run down your spine as you picture the books being torn apart, perhaps even burned, in the name of religious purity. This wasn't military conquest. This was ideological warfare. It wasn't about seizing territory, but purifying belief. It's a stark reminder that knowledge, even when housed in magnificent institutions, is vulnerable to the passions and prejudices of human beings. This event at the Serapeum marked a major blow. While it may not have been the complete burning of the entire Library of Alexandria that popular legend often portrays, it was a significant act of cultural vandalism and a clear indicator of the rising tide of Christian intolerance towards pagan institutions. The loss of texts from the Serapeum was undoubtedly immense, contributing further to the fragmentation and disappearance of the once vast Alexandrian collection. So, as you reflect on this period, you realize that the decline of the library wasn't just about fires or political neglect. It was also deeply intertwined with the intense, often violent, spiritual transformations sweeping across the Roman world. The clash between old gods and new, between ancient philosophies and nascent dogmas, had profound and devastating consequences for the legacy of human knowledge stored in Alexandria. The once vibrant, open intellectual haven was slowly, incrementally, being chipped away by forces far more pervasive than any single army or fire. You've just experienced the dramatic, almost visceral clash of ideologies at the Serapeum, a stark reminder that belief systems, when left unchecked, can be just as destructive as any army. This moment, the destruction of the Serapeum Temple and its associated library in 390. 1C feels significant, and it was, but to truly understand the library's complex demise, we need to zoom in on a figure who often gets caught in the crosshairs of this tumultuous era, Hypatia. Imagine yourself in Alexandria around the early 4th century CE. The city is still a prominent center, but it's increasingly fraught with religious tension. The vibrant pagan traditions are on the defensive, while Christian zeal is ascendant. In this charged atmosphere, a truly extraordinary woman shines brightly, Hypatia. Hypatia was a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer. She was also the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, a prestigious position. Think of her as a rock star scholar, a brilliant public speaker, and a captivating teacher. She taught both Christian and pagan students, lecturing on Plato, Aristotle, mathematics, and astronomy. She was renowned for her intellect, her eloquence, and her striking beauty. Her fame was so widespread that people traveled from far and wide just to hear her speak. It's truly remarkable for a woman in that era to achieve such a level of intellectual prominence and public respect. She was, in many ways, the last great scholar of the Alexandrian pagan tradition. Now, here's where the story takes a dark turn, illustrating the dangerous fanaticism that was brewing in the city. The Christian patriarch of Alexandria at this time was Cyril. Cyril was a powerful, ambitious, and utterly ruthless figure. He was determined to assert Christian dominance over Alexandria, and saw Hypatia, with her prominent pagan school and her influential friends, including the Roman prefect Orestes, who was Cyril's political rival, as a symbol of the old order that needed to be dismantled. Here's a quirky little detail that often gets overlooked. While Hypatia was pagan, there's no historical evidence she was actively anti-Christian. In fact, some of her students were Christians. Her crime was perhaps her very existence as an independent, influential intellectual who refused to convert and whose teachings, rooted in Neoplatonic philosophy, were seen as a rival to Christian dogma. She was a beacon of philosophical inquiry in an age increasingly defined by religious certainty. In 415 CE, the simmering tensions erupted into tragedy. A mob, inflamed by rumors and sermons, some directly from Cyril's followers, accusing Hypatia of witchcraft and hindering reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril seized her. You can almost feel the dread in the air as this mob, possibly monks from the Nitrian desert known for their fanatical zeal, drags her through the streets. The exact details of her death are gruesome and deeply disturbing. They stripped her, scourged her with pottery shards, and tore her limb from limb, then burned her remains. It was an unspeakably brutal act of mob violence, fueled by religious hatred and political intrigue. Her murder is a profoundly sad and symbolic moment. It wasn't about the burning of books, at least not directly. It was about the destruction of a living, breathing embodiment of Alexandrian pagan scholarship. It sent a chilling message: independent thought, especially if it challenged the rising religious authority, was no longer safe in Alexandria. It represented the triumph of religious fundamentalism over intellectual freedom, a stark contrast to the intellectual openness that had characterized the library's golden age. Historians still debate Cyril's direct involvement in orchestrating the murder. Did he explicitly order it, or did his inflammatory sermons simply create an environment where such an atrocity became inevitable? Regardless, the responsibility for creating the climate that allowed such a horrific act cannot be easily dismissed. Cyril was later canonized as a saint, a decision that continues to spark controversy among those who remember Hypatia's fate. It's a stark reminder that history is often written by the victors, and sainthood doesn't always align with modern ethical standards. Hypatia's death dealt a severe psychological blow to the intellectual life of Alexandria. Many scholars likely fled, fearing for their own safety. The vibrant philosophical schools, already diminished, would likely have withered further, while the library building itself, or what remained of, it may not have been physically destroyed in this incident. The murder of Hypatia signaled the end of an era, taught the end of the kind of open, pagan, friendly intellectual atmosphere that allowed institutions like the library to thrive. So, as you reflect on Hypatia's tragic story, you realize that the decline of Alexandria as the ancient world's intellectual powerhouse wasn't just about lost scrolls. It was also about the systematic dismantling of the cultural and philosophical infrastructure that supported such institutions, and the extinguishing of the very spirit of free inquiry itself. The stage was now set for the final, slow disappearance of one of humanity's greatest intellectual treasures. Not with a bang, but with a chilling ideological whimper. You've just witnessed the brutal tragedy of Hypatia's murder, a chilling symptom of the escalating religious tensions in Alexandria. This period, the late 6th and early 12th centuries CE, is where the narrative about the Library of Alexandria's final demise often becomes intertwined with the actions of the burgeoning Christian community. It's a complex and often emotionally charged part of the story, so let's wade into it carefully. Imagine standing amidst the fervent atmosphere of Alexandria, where the Christian population now forms a significant and increasingly dominant force. For many zealous Christians, the ancient pagan temples and their associated institutions, including the Serapeum, which housed a significant collection of books, were not just places of different worship. They were symbols of a worldview that directly opposed their new exclusive faith. From their perspective, these were idolatrous structures, dens of heresy and superstition. Now, you might think, but surely they wouldn't destroy knowledge itself. And here's where it gets complicated. For some, separating the knowledge from the pagan context was impossible. A scroll containing a Greek epic poem, a philosophical treatise, or even a scientific text was to some tainted by its association with a non-Christian world. They saw themselves as purifying the world, sweeping away the old to make way for the new. It was a spiritual revolution, and like many revolutions, it could be uncomfortably zealous. The destruction of the Serapeum in 390 1C, which we touched on earlier, is a key moment here. Patriarch Theophilus, the Christian leader, instigated this event. The Serapeum was not just a temple. It was a vast complex that included a daughter library to the main library. The mob, incited by religious fervor, tore down the statues, looted the treasures, and almost certainly destroyed the scrolls within the library. This wasn't a military siege by an outside power. This was an internal, ideologically driven purge. You might picture zealots, their faces grim with conviction, throwing papyrus scrolls onto bonfires. It's a horrifying image for anyone who values learning. The loss from this single event was undoubtedly immense, though again, we lack precise inventories of what was lost. These weren't just pagan religious texts. They were likely scientific, philosophical, and literary works that were simply collateral damage in the war on paganism. A quirky detail about this period. It wasn't just about direct destruction. There was also a more subtle, yet equally damaging process at play: neglect and repurposing. Imagine Christian communities needing building materials for new churches or monasteries. A readily available source: old pagan temples and institutions. So, while not always malicious destruction, ancient stones and even papyrus, which could be reused or recycled for other purposes, might have simply been carted away over time, contributing to the slow dismantling of these ancient sites. It was less about deliberate ideological destruction of every book, and more about the cultural shift away from supporting and maintaining these pagan associated institutions. Historians still debate the degree of Christian culpability in the overall demise of the entire Library of Alexandria. Was it the primary cause, or just one significant factor among many? Some argue that the early Christians were systematically destroying pagan knowledge. Others maintain that the library was already in decline due to political instability, neglect, and previous damage, and that the Christian actions were more about targeting specific pagan temples and cults rather than a generalized war on all books. It's an uncomfortable discussion because it forces us to confront the darker side of religious zeal. What is undeniable is that the intellectual climate profoundly changed. The old, inclusive spirit of Hellenistic learning, where all knowledge was welcomed and debated, was increasingly replaced by a more dogmatic approach. If a text didn't align with Christian doctrine, or if it was deemed pagan, its value diminished significantly, leading to less copying, less preservation, and ultimately greater chances of its loss over time. The incentives for maintaining a universal collection of knowledge simply weren't there in the same way. So, as you step back from this charged period, you realize that the Christian perspective on the library was complex. For some, it was a source of ancient wisdom to be selectively integrated. For others, particularly the more fanatical elements, it was a monument to a false religion, and its destruction was a necessary act of purification. The impact of these beliefs and actions, whether direct destruction or cultural neglect, contributed significantly to the library's fragmentation and ultimate disappearance as the dominant intellectual force it once was. The great beacon of knowledge was dimming, not just from accidental fires or political neglect, but from the fiery clash of deeply held convictions. You've seen the Library of Alexandria endure Roman political shifts and the intense rise of Christianity. Now, as the Roman Empire in the West crumbles and the Byzantine Empire rises in the East, a new power emerges from the desert sands, bringing with it a fresh wave of cultural and intellectual influence, the Arab Islamic conquest. And with this new arrival comes one of the most persistent and hotly debated legends surrounding the library's final fate. Imagine the year is 642 CE. The vibrant, ancient city of Alexandria is besieged, not by Romans or Byzantines, but by the armies of the nascent Islamic Caliphate, led by the general Amr ibn al, as, after a long siege, the city falls. This marks the end of Byzantine rule in Egypt and the beginning of centuries of Islamic governance. Now, this is where the famous, almost cinematic story comes in. The tale goes that Amr ibn al as after conquering Alexandria, was approached by a scholar, often identified as John Philoponus, a Christian philosopher. Philoponus supposedly asked Amr what should be done with the books of the Great Library. Amr, in turn, sought guidance from the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab in Medina. And here's the legendary, chilling reply attributed to Caliph Umar: if those books are in agreement with the Quran, we have no need of them. And if they are opposed to the Quran, destroy them. Imagine the scene. Thousands upon thousands of priceless scrolls hauled out of the library, used as fuel for the city's public baths. The story claims that the books were so numerous that they supplied the baths for 6 months. Or even a year. It's a powerful, devastating image, symbolizing the alleged intellectual vandalism of the early Islamic conquests. But here's the thing about grand dramatic legends. They often have a shaky relationship with historical fact. This story, while widely circulated for centuries, is almost universally rejected by modern historians as a later fabrication. Why do historians doubt it? Well, for several reasons. First, this account doesn't appear in any primary historical source written at the time of the conquest or in the immediate centuries following it. The earliest known mention of this specific tale comes from the 9th century, almost 600 years after the events it describes. That's a massive gap in time, akin to us telling a detailed, first-hand account of what happened during the Roman Empire, based solely on stories that only emerged in the 9th century. Accounts that appear much later are naturally viewed with more skepticism, especially if they contradict earlier, more reliable sources. Second, the historical evidence suggests that the Library of Alexandria, as a unified, vast collection, had already largely ceased to exist long before the Arab conquest. As we've discussed, it had suffered multiple blows. Caesar's fire, the political instability of the later Ptolemies, the expulsion of scholars by Ptolemy VIII, the destruction of the Serapeum, and centuries of general neglect, fragmentation, and the sheer fragility of papyrus scrolls. By 642 CE, it's highly improbable that a massive collection of hundreds of thousands of scrolls still remained intact and functional in the same way it did during its Ptolemaic Golden Age. A quirky little detail that often gets overlooked. The early Islamic Caliphate, far from being anti-intellectual, actually became a great patron of learning and scholarship. The Golden Age of Islam, which saw immense advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, was built on the very Greek and Roman knowledge that the Alexandrian library once housed. Islamic scholars diligently translated countless Greek texts into Arabic, preserving much of the classical heritage that would otherwise have been lost to the West during its dark ages. It would be incredibly contradictory for a culture that later so enthusiastically embraced and built upon Hellenistic knowledge to have simultaneously destroyed its primary source in such a wanton manner. Historians still debate the precise motives behind the fabrication and persistence of this legend. Was it an attempt by later Christian writers to demonize Muslim conquerors, or perhaps an allegorical tale intended to convey a different message? So, while the story of Caliph Umar burning the library's books in the baths is a powerful one, it almost certainly didn't happen as described. It's a testament to how enduring a good dramatic story can be, even when contradicted by historical evidence. The Arab conquest of Alexandria was a significant event, but it was likely the culmination of a long process of decline for the library, rather than its single, definitive act of destruction. The Library of Alexandria, as an unparalleled repository of global knowledge, was probably already a ghost of its former self by the time Amr ibn as rode into the city. You've heard the dramatic tale of Caliph Umar and the burning of the books, a story so compelling it's woven itself into the fabric of popular history. But as we've explored, That account is very likely a later invention, a convenient narrative rather than a historical truth. So, if the Arab conquest wasn't the final, decisive blow, then what really happened to all those missing books? This is where we sift through the whispered legends and fragmented evidence, trying to distinguish between folklore and historical reality. Imagine yourself as an ancient historian piecing together fragments of papyrus, cross-referencing conflicting accounts, and trying to understand why such a monumental institution seemed to vanish. The issue with many of the dramatic destruction narratives, be it Caesar's fire, Christian zealots, or Muslim conquerors sought, is that they seek a single, clear, satisfying answer. But history, particularly when it comes to the slow decline of vast institutions, is rarely that tidy. One of the most pervasive aspects of these legends is the idea of a singular, catastrophic event. You might ask yourself, why do people want there to be a single villain, a single blaze that wiped out all that knowledge? Perhaps it's simpler to grasp, easier to assign blame, and more emotionally impactful than the slow, grinding reality of decay. A dramatic burning makes for a better story than the quiet, unassuming work of bookworms and damp. Let's consider the nature of oral traditions and storytelling. For centuries, stories were passed down orally before being written. Details get exaggerated, characters become archetypes, and events merge. The legend of Umar burning the books fits this pattern perfectly. It became a powerful narrative, perhaps amplified by later tensions between different religious groups, even if it had no basis in contemporary accounts. Think of it like a game of historical telephone. By the time the story is written down centuries later, it's far removed from its original source. Here's a quirky little detail about how knowledge was sometimes valued differently in different eras. While the early Ptolemies coveted every scroll, later periods might have seen less value in certain texts. For instance, as Christianity solidified its doctrines, pagan philosophical texts might have been seen as less relevant or even dangerous. This isn't necessarily about outright destruction, but about shifting cultural priorities. If no one bothers to copy a text or store it properly, its chances of survival plummet over centuries. Even without a single match being lit, it's a slow intellectual erosion. Historians still debate the precise point at which the main library ceased to function in any meaningful way. Was it a gradual decline from the Roman period onwards, with various blows chipping away at its collection and intellectual vibrancy? Or was there a later, less well documented event that finally sealed its fate? Most scholars lean towards the idea of a drawn out, multi-faceted decline rather than a single, sudden end. The truth is, much of the library's decline was probably less about dramatic conflagrations and more about the mundane realities of ancient life. Imagine neglect. Buildings fall into disrepair without constant maintenance. Scrolls need climate control, protection from insects, and regular recopying as they decay. Lack of funds, as dynasties changed and priorities shifted. The immense funding the library once enjoyed probably dwindled, making it harder to maintain the collection and pay scholars. Fragmentation and dispersion. As scholars fled political upheavals or sought patronage elsewhere, they often took valuable texts with them, leading to the dispersal of parts of the collection. Think of it as intellectual diaspora. Natural decay. Papyrus is incredibly fragile. It's susceptible to humidity, fire, insects, and simply crumbling with age. Without constant, meticulous recopying, scrolls would naturally degrade and be lost over centuries. This is arguably the biggest, most silent destroyer of ancient knowledge. So, when you hear these dramatic legends, remember to ask, who told this story? And when? What was their agenda? Did they have access to contemporary accounts? Often, the simpler, more dramatic narrative hides a far more complex and perhaps less satisfying historical truth. The mystery of the library's missing books is less about a single culprit and more about the relentless march of time, the changing tides of power, and the inherent fragility of human creations, even those dedicated to immortal knowledge. The next chapter will explore the relentless, silent work of nature and time on these ancient treasures. You've heard the dramatic tales of fire and religious zeal, and how they likely don't tell the whole story of the library's disappearance. Now, let's peel back another layer, stepping away from human conflict and towards a far more insidious and often overlooked destroyer of ancient knowledge, the slow, relentless march of time and the inherent fragility of its ancient forms. Imagine for a moment not a grand burning, but a quiet, damp corner within a storage room. The air is humid. A subtle smell of decay hangs heavy. You might spot tiny silverfish diligently munching away at the edges of a scroll, or perhaps faint traces of mold slowly spreading its dark tendrils across delicate papyrus fibers. This is the unglamorous, yet devastating reality for most ancient texts. The primary material for books in ancient Alexandria was papyrus. Think of it as an early form of paper made from the pith of the papyrus plant, sliced into thin strips, pressed, dried, and then glued together to form long sheets that were rolled into scrolls. While revolutionary for its time, papyrus was far from indestructible. It was incredibly vulnerable to humidity and dampness. Alexandria, being a coastal city, experiences significant humidity. Papyrus absorbs moisture, becoming prone to mold and mildew, which literally eats away at the organic material. Imagine pages turning to mush, then dissolving into dust. Insects and rodents, bookworms, the literal kind, not the metaphorical ones. Silverfish and rodents saw papyrus as a tasty snack. A small infestation could quietly, yet systematically, destroy entire sections of a collection over years and decades. Fire, even small ones. While we've debated the scale of Caesar's fire, even smaller, localized fires, an overturned oil lamp, a kitchen fire spreading, could claim thousands of scrolls. Once ignited, papyrus, especially when dry and brittle, burns fiercely. Brittle aging over centuries. Papyrus naturally degrades. It becomes dry, brittle, and prone to crumbling at the slightest touch. Imagine trying to unroll a scroll that feels like dried leaves. It would simply shatter. Fading ink. The ink used, often carbon-based, could also fade over time, making texts unreadable, even if the papyrus remained intact. Now, here's a quirky detail to consider. The very act of reading and handling these scrolls contributed to their decay. Each time a scholar unrolled a scroll, small fibers would break, edges would fray, and the material would weaken. It was a constant battle against entropy. To preserve knowledge, you needed dedicated scribes, constantly recopying texts. Imagine the sheer volume of work involved in transcribing a library of hundreds of thousands of scrolls every few generations, just to keep them viable. This brings us to a crucial point: the lack of consistent, dedicated maintenance and recopying. In its golden age, the library had an army of scribes. But as political patronage waned, as the intellectual climate shifted, and as other priorities took precedence, who would fund and staff this massive, continuous effort? The resources, human and financial, dwindled without constant care. The scrolls would inevitably decay. Historians still debate exactly when the systematic recopying efforts ceased or significantly diminished. Was it during the Roman period, the Christian era, or a slow tapering off over centuries? There isn't a single clear answer, but it's clear the process was not indefinite. So, when you think of the missing books, don't just imagine a dramatic bonfire. Imagine centuries of slow, quiet decay. Picture thousands of scrolls becoming unreadable due to mold, insect damage, or simply crumbling into dust. Imagine them being discarded because they were too fragile to handle, or simply forgotten in some damp corner as the custodianship of the library changed hands and priorities shifted. The slow demise was also intertwined with the decline of Alexandria's prominence as a singular intellectual hub. As other libraries and centers of learning emerged across the Roman and later Byzantine and Islamic worlds, knowledge began to disperse. People interested in a particular text might go to a different city where a copy existed rather than always relying on Alexandria. This decentralization, while positive for the overall spread of knowledge, meant less incentive to preserve every single original within the Alexandrian collection. In essence, the greatest destroyer of the library's physical collection was likely time itself, aided by neglect, environmental factors, and the inherent fragility of its medium. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic explosion, but a prolonged, drawn-out fade, a testament to the fact that even the most immense human efforts against oblivion eventually succumb to the relentless forces of nature. And yet, remarkably, much of the knowledge found a way to survive, echoing through different cultures and languages. You've absorbed the sobering reality of the library's slow decay, the silent work of time and papyrus eating pests. It's a less dramatic ending than a fiery inferno, but perhaps a more profound one. Yet, even as the physical scrolls of Alexandria turned to dust or fragmented beyond recognition, the knowledge they contained didn't entirely vanish into the ether. This is where the story shifts from loss to resilience, from destruction to transmission. Imagine the ancient world as a vast, interconnected network, a bit like the internet, but powered by human minds and painstaking manual labor. While Alexandria was an unparalleled hub, it was never the only place where knowledge resided. There were other libraries, other scholarly centers, and, crucially, countless individual scholars who traveled, taught, and copied texts. Think of it like this. If you have a unique document on your computer and your hard drive crashes, it's gone. But if you've shared copies with friends, or if it was part of a shared cloud drive, then the information persists, even if your original is lost. Ancient knowledge operated in a similar, albeit much slower, fashion. One of the most important ways knowledge survived was through copying and recopying. Before the printing press, every book was a handwritten manuscript. So, a popular or important text would naturally be copied many times, not just in Alexandria, but in Athens, Pergamon, Rome, Byzantium, and later, Baghdad. If Alexandria held the master copy of a text, chances are numerous other copies were already circulating throughout the Mediterranean world. While the original Alexandrian scroll might have perished, the content lived on in these other copies. This is arguably the most significant factor in how classical knowledge endured. Here's a quirky detail to consider. Sometimes a text would be lost to one culture, only to resurface centuries later in another. For instance, many Greek philosophical and scientific works vanished from Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. They were literally lost to the Latin-speaking world. However, these very same texts were meticulously preserved and translated into Arabic by Islamic scholars during their golden age. You might envision a scene in 7th century Baghdad, in a magnificent institution like the House of Wisdom. Here, scholars from diverse backgrounds were actively seeking out, translating and studying Greek, Persian, and Indian texts. They saw immense value in these ancient works, not as pagan relics to be destroyed, but as foundational knowledge upon which to build their own advancements. Think of it as a massive intellectual rescue mission. It's thanks to these dedicated Arabic translators and scholars that much of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy survived for posterity. Historians still debate the extent to which these translations were direct copies from Alexandria, or if they came from other surviving libraries and private collections across the Byzantine and Persian empires. The answer is likely a mix of both, showcasing the distributed nature of ancient knowledge. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire, also played a crucial role. while the Western Roman Empire declined, Constantinople maintained a strong intellectual tradition, preserving many Greek texts in its own libraries and monastic scriptoria. So, even as Alexandria faded, other centers of learning kept the flame alive. Finally, the scholars themselves acted as conduits. When scholars left Alexandria, either voluntarily or by expulsion, as in Ptolemy VIII's time, they often carried knowledge, and sometimes even copies of texts. With them, they dispersed across the ancient world, establishing new schools, teaching, and contributing to other intellectual centers. Their minds, filled with the wisdom they had absorbed in Alexandria, became living libraries, disseminating knowledge far and wide. So, while the grand, unified collection of the Library of Alexandria might have disintegrated, its intellectual legacy did not. It fractured, dispersed, and went underground, only to re-emerge and be reinterpreted in different cultures and languages. The missing books weren't necessarily missing from the entire world. They were often just missing from Alexandria itself, having found new homes and new custodians elsewhere. This hidden continuity of knowledge, flowing like an underground river, is one of the most remarkable aspects of humanity's long intellectual journey. It reminds us that knowledge, unlike physical objects, is incredibly resilient, finding ways to survive even the most devastating challenges. You've seen how the knowledge of Alexandria didn't simply vanish, but rather dispersed and found new homes. Now, let's step back and reflect on the materials themselves. The very flesh and bones of ancient books, the humble papyrus scroll. It's a subtle but crucial piece of the puzzle, because the fragility of this ancient medium played an enormous, if understated, role in the library's decline. Imagine a single papyrus scroll. It's not a sturdy hardcover book you can toss into a backpack. It's a delicate, rolled up sheet, often many meters long, made from processed plant fibers. Each time it's unrolled, read and re-rolled, it suffers minute damage. It's like bending a piece of paper over and over again. Eventually, it weakens and tears. Think about the sheer volume of such material in the library. We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of scrolls. That's an unfathomable amount of delicate material to manage and preserve. To keep such a collection viable for centuries required an almost superhuman level of dedication and resources. Here's a quirky detail that modern librarians will appreciate. Preserving ancient scrolls wasn't just about protecting them from fire or invaders. It was a constant battle against nature itself. Climate control, or lack thereof. Alexandria's humid coastal climate was terrible for papyrus. Moisture encourages mold and mildew, which literally consume the organic material. Imagine black spots spreading, eating away at the text, leaving holes and brittle fragments. Pests, we've mentioned silverfish and rodents. But ancient libraries faced a constant onslaught from all manner of critters who saw papyrus as a delicious meal. These silent invaders could slowly, meticulously destroy entire sections of a collection, scroll by scroll, over decades and centuries. Light exposure, constant exposure to sunlight could fade the ink and make the papyrus brittle. Even indirect light over long periods would cause damage. Handling damage every time a scroll was pulled from its cubby, unrolled for reading, and then re-rolled, it risked tearing, creasing, or fraying. Scholars, however careful, would inevitably contribute to the wear and tear. So, for a scroll to survive, it needed to be diligently cared for. This meant constant dusting, proper storage in dry, dark conditions, and most importantly, recopying. If a scroll started to show signs of decay, it would ideally be painstakingly copied by a scribe onto fresh papyrus. This was a slow, expensive, and labor-intensive process. A single scribe might take days or even weeks to copy a long text. Now, imagine the implications of this. In its heyday, the Library of Alexandria had royal patronage and a dedicated corps of scribes. But as the Ptolemaic dynasty weakened, as Roman priorities shifted, and as Christian zealots gained influence, the consistent funding and manpower for this monumental preservation effort would have dwindled. Historians still debate the exact timeline of when this systematic recopying and maintenance essentially ceased or became unsustainable. Was it a slow erosion of resources from the Roman period onwards, or a more pronounced decline in the later centuries as the city itself underwent profound changes? It's unlikely there was a single off switch, but rather a gradual fade. Without constant recopying, scrolls would naturally decay. If a text wasn't considered important enough, or if the funds weren't available, or if the scribes weren't trained, that particular piece of knowledge would simply crumble into oblivion. This wasn't malicious destruction. It was just the relentless, unforgiving reality of the physical world meeting the limitations of ancient technology. The shift to parchment vellum as a writing material, which was more durable than papyrus, but also more expensive, might have helped preserve some texts, but it wasn't a widespread solution in Alexandria early enough to save the bulk of the papyrus collection. And later, the move from scrolls to codices, bound books, like the ones we use today, made texts easier to handle and store. But again, this transition happened too late for the vast original collection. Ultimately, the fragility of papyrus, combined with centuries of changing political priorities, shifting intellectual interests, and the inevitable wear and tear of time, formed a powerful, almost insurmountable force of decay. It wasn't just dramatic fires or ideological purges that consumed the library. It was the quiet, constant, insidious work of dust, damp, and countless tiny nibbling creatures. The overwhelming majority of texts stored in ancient libraries, regardless of their location, simply succumbed to the passage of time. The Library of Alexandria, despite its legendary status, was not immune to these universal forces of entropy. You've delved into the myriad reasons behind the Library of Alexandria's decline: political upheaval, religious fervor, and the relentless, silent work of nature on fragile papyrus. It's clear that there wasn't a single burning event that wiped it clean, but a long, complex process of decay, fragmentation, and shifting priorities. But even though the original physical collection is gone, the story of the library doesn't end there. In fact, its enduring legacy is perhaps most evident in the efforts to rebuild and remember. Imagine for a moment the turn of the century. Thousands of years after its initial rise, a new vision takes shape on the Alexandrian waterfront, almost exactly where the ancient library is believed to have stood. This isn't just a nostalgic nod to the past, it's a bold, ambitious statement about the future. In 2002, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, Library of Alexandria, officially opened its doors. This modern library is a striking architectural marvel, a colossal, tilted disc designed to evoke the ancient Egyptian sun disk, half submerged in the earth. Its main reading room, with tiered levels and natural light pouring in, is designed to accommodate thousands of readers. It's a truly breathtaking space, a stark contrast to the small, rolled scrolls of antiquity, now housing millions of physical books, digital resources, and a planetarium, museums, and art galleries. This isn't an attempt to replace the lost scrolls of the past. That's impossible. Instead, it's a symbolic reincarnation, a dedication to the same principles that drove the ancient Ptolemies: the pursuit of knowledge, the celebration of human intellect, and the desire to be a global hub of learning. It serves as a universal library, a research institution, and a cultural center for Egypt and the wider world. It's a recognition that the idea of the Library of Alexandria is just as powerful, if not more so, than the physical collection itself. Here's a quirky little detail about the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Its exterior wall is covered in carved letters from every known alphabet in the world, symbolizing the universality of knowledge and language. It's a powerful visual reminder of the ancient library's ambition to collect all human wisdom, regardless of its origin. This modern iteration is built to be resilient, designed with state of the art climate control, fire suppression systems, and digital preservation technologies that the ancients could only have dreamed of. Historians still debate the exact site of the ancient Royal Library within the broader museum complex, while the modern library is built on what is believed to be the general area. Definitive archaeological proof of the original structure has remained elusive. This ongoing quest only adds to the mystique, reminding us that some mysteries are content to remain just that. The legacy of the Library of Alexandria today is multifaceted. It represents the power of ambition. It shows what humanity can achieve when it dedicates vast resources and intellect to a singular goal of knowledge acquisition. The fragility of knowledge. Its decline serves as a poignant reminder that even the greatest intellectual treasures are vulnerable to political instability, religious intolerance, and the slow creep of decay. It underscores the constant need for vigilance in preserving our shared heritage. The resilience of ideas. Despite the physical loss, the idea of the library, its systematic approach to collecting, cataloging, and disseminating knowledge, influenced countless libraries and academic institutions that followed, from the medieval monasteries to modern universities. The very concept of a universal library, a place where all human thought is gathered, can be traced back to Alexandria. So, as you visualize this gleaming modern library, standing on the very shores where its ancient predecessor once rose, you realize the story of the Library of Alexandria isn't just about what was lost. It's also about what was preserved, what was transferred, and what was ultimately reborn. It's a testament to humanity's enduring and often desperate desire to understand the world, to gather wisdom, and to pass it on to future generations. No matter the obstacles, the questions surrounding its missing books continue to haunt us, a silent challenge to ensure that the intellectual flame, once so brightly lit in ancient Alexandria, never truly goes out. Now, as the echoes of ancient Alexandria begin to soften and the grand halls of knowledge slowly fade from your mind's eye, allow yourself to drift. The stories of forgotten scrolls and whispers of long lost wisdom are gently dissolving into the quiet hum of the night. You've journeyed through centuries, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and felt the delicate touch of papyrus. Now just a memory on the wind. The answers we sought about what truly happened are perhaps less about a singular event and more about the endless, intricate dance between creation and decay, between human brilliance and human frailty. Let the mysteries linger like soft shadows in the twilight, reminding you that sometimes the most profound lessons are found in the spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine. The weight of history, once so vibrant and demanding, now softens, becoming light as a feather, guiding you deeper into the quietude of rest.